we are going to keep moving forward here, and we want to talk about one aspect of this that I think has, certainly been notable for those who have wanted to pay attention, and that is this huge upsurge of support for the Palestinian people happening really in every corner of the globe, it seems. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Layan Sima Fuleihan, who is the education director at the People's Forum and an editor at 1804 Books. Layan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. And I guess I'll just start by asking you, I always hate to say that anything is unprecedented, of course, because, that's rarely true. But nonetheless, this does seem like a major inflection point. I mean, the scale and the breadth and the depth of the protest happening in solidarity with Palestine, it really does seem notable in terms of the politics of the issue, especially here in the West.
I think you're absolutely right. I heard Rania talking about the cable news, and there's definitely an attempt to minimize the amount of support that the Palestinian struggle has from working people across the world, but it's not succeeding in a sense. What we saw since October 7 was an immediate and massive outpouring in every corner, in particular from the Arab people and the Arab diaspora, but also from across the global south and even within the Western and imperial countries like the United States, across Europe, Canada. I think it's something that's actually absolutely incredible and notable and a lot different from the other moments that we've seen in the past, for sure.
Definitely think that something feels different right now. It does seem like the Israelis are losing the narrative war this time around. And a part of that is because they're just being so unbelievably vicious. And of course, their politicians and leaders are going on, various cable news channels and just openly inciting genocide and saying the quiet part out loud. But I want to, I'm curious if you can talk a bit about like the upsurge in protests. Is this unique for this issue? I know there have been past bombardments of Gaza. There was 2008, 2009. There's 2014, there's 2021, and then there was, smaller versions in between all of those Israeli wars on Gaza. And each time I do remember protests taking place. I'm not in the U.S. right now, but I have seen images of really massive rallies around the country. Is this bigger than what we've seen in the past in terms of the support for Palestine in the streets?
I would say so. Actually, I would say so. And of course, it's always an estimate. But the feeling, the spirit of people, the way in which people are mobilizing feels a lot more significant this time. And it's in particular in the face of a really outright and very obvious attempt on the part of the White House to immediately create a situation like a post 9/11 situation, where they try to dominate the narrative and say immediately that this quote unquote war between Hamas and Israel is started with the attack of Hamas. And the main sentiment that people should be feeling, that people in the United States should be feeling, is grief for Israel. And there was a lot put into that from both media and also government officials. And despite that, here in New York City, where I'm based, when after we started taking to the streets, it was clearly becoming much more and more massive. And there was a direct attempt by the mayor to say, listen, don't go out to the streets, mobilize the entire police force, and still 20,000 people came out. And it's only grown since then. Just shows the weakness of this narrative coming from the White House and its media institutions, where people are recognizing that this is not just a conflict between two, as they would like it to seem, two equal bodies, Hamas and Israel, or a conflict where Israel needs to defend itself. People are seeing this as actually a liberation struggle, and everyone is identifying with it. And I think this also has something to do with the experience that most people have had over the past couple of years that's really shaken to the core the U.S. capitalist and imperialist project. It's very hard for people to identify with it. There's been a series of different events and crises that have chipped away at that mask. And at this point now, it takes Biden going out on national television to say, we stand with Israel. Israel didn't bomb the hospital, all sorts of lies. And it's not being received well by the public. Of course, there are ways that it's still effective. All the power of the U.S. Institutions are behind it. But people are recognizing it, are seeing it, and are mobilizing, and they're continuing to mobilize. And I think that's something that's in particular very significant. It's not dying down. It's been since October 7. It's still building up. Every day there's actions. Just yesterday, on campuses across the country, people walked out. We're building, all of us, towards a big mobilization in Washington, D.C. on November 4. That's likely to be one of the biggest mobilizations for Palestine in the past decades. It's just continuing, and that's something that's, I don't think, has been seen before.
No, I think you make the point very well, and you mentioned it sort of obliquely, and I want to dig a little bit more into it in terms of some of the experiences that I think have sensitized people, at least here in the United States, but I think in other parts of the world. I mean, you tell me what you think about this, Layan. I mean, I've certainly felt, I remember it like it was yesterday, in Ferguson, when the Palestinians came out on social media, which in and of itself was a new invention to tell people how to fight the tear gas, because it was the same tear gas being used in Palestine. And of course, you have to name check the journalist, grassroots journalist Bassem Masri, of course, who played an important role in making those connections. But it seems like since that moment in 2014, it really has been a change in how many people, especially younger people, have viewed this issue of Palestine and the deeper issue of solidarity between oppressed people. So I just hope you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you raise a really good reference. From Ferguson onward, I think there has been a shift. And in particular in 2020, when I think it was 35 million people is the estimate of people who were out on the streets after the assassination of George Floyd, and were met with military-grade repression. And when you experience that, and then you see the news, and you see the Palestinian people going out and protesting and demanding their rights and fighting back against the apartheid and the occupation, and being met with military repression and assassination, and a lot of times some of the same tools that the police forces are using here, exactly like you said, Eugene. It's really hard then to say, okay, the victim actually is the Israeli occupation, because when you have that shared experience, it's really difficult. And we've had 35 million people who've had that experience from all backgrounds. Not to mention the fact that there is a very strong Palestinian and Arab and Muslim community in the United States that really sees the Palestinian struggle as central to the understanding of the world, and sees this as a liberation struggle. So that combined, I think, is creating a new inflection point, and is creating a political crisis for the U.S. project of imperialism that uses Zionism as one of its main instruments to dominate the region.
Oh, Ron, you're muted.
Of course I am. Sorry, this happens every time. I'm used that you don't hear when I turn on my AC. Sorry, I'm not going to explain it. Anyways, and regular viewers of the show know. So my apologies for that. But what I was going to say is, you mentioned that the Biden administration's attempt to try to create this post 9/11 atmosphere of fear and generally just hatred of Muslims and Arabs, and on top of that, you have this, I think, unprecedented level of, it's just like the sort of pro-Israel lobby that has spent the last 20 years building these various institutions and centers where they can suppress and attack people from and force measures of censorship. They've kind of pulled out all the stops in this moment. We're used to people getting fired for just like retweeting The Onion, right? We've seen that happen. We've seen, a Hollywood executive of a major Hollywood agency get fired for retweeting a very all people are human kind of thing. And both sides, we don't want anyone to die on both sides. There's just been also academia. We've seen, all of those various attack dogs come out for professors coming after students. We've seen a professor write in the Wall Street Journal, "Don't hire my law students. They're all anti-Semites," just crazy things like this. So the atmosphere right now does seem to be a very chilling one. However, despite that, you see people still putting their livelihoods on the line to say, no, enough, I'm standing against this. I'm just curious if you could speak to that, to the fact that Israel's supporters, because they have no grassroots support, have to rely on bullying and censorship and suppression from their allies in positions of power. Whereas on the other side, you see something very real, very raw, and very grassroots. I think it was Ali Abu Nima who said he hasn't seen a single pro-Israel rally. I mean, that might not be true, but I haven't either. So I'm curious if you can sort of speak to those dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some artificial intelligence created photos that have been circulating of pro-Israel rallies recently, and you have to like wonder if you have to, and it's so obviously generated by a robot, but if you have to rely on those things and whether or not it's a joke, it's really, it shows the weakness of Zionist support among the grassroots, and I think that's absolutely true. And what part of what is actually very revealing is that the tactics that they use are so despicable and are actually very clearly racist, dehumanizing, colonial mentalities that it doesn't convince people. I mean, here we've had a series of these, the trucks with the video billboards on them, driving around to campuses and projecting the name, the photo and the name and the information of students who openly support or have solidarity with Palestine. And they are doing this as a threatening tactic. They're even trying to drive to those people's houses now with the truck. Who is going to get behind that level of horrendous attack? I mean, they're intimidating young people, intimidating students. It doesn't really make the case for Zionism as a victim here. It's really not very convincing. On the other hand, you have now a moment where people are actually having to confront this kind of fear tactic. I mean, and it's not to be underestimated. There was even a young boy in Illinois who was stabbed to death, a young Palestinian boy. There's been a rise in hate crimes that is absolutely horrendous, and it is causing fear. And so people are having to make the choice. Am I going to succumb to this fear? Or am I going to join this mass movement, this collectivity that's going to have my back, that's going, that I actually can identify with? And the majority of people are making that latter choice. And I think that's something that's really powerful because it really just the fear tactics are something that are supposed to help make us feel like, we have to hide, we have to silence our voices because it's going to be too dangerous. It's a lot harder to attack a large group than it is to attack individuals. And I think people are seeing that and they're building off of it. And even to the point of seeing people being proud for being fired. And that's something that really I think is heartwarming in this moment because no matter what, it's not going to be intimidated. And this is coming from the funder of the Zionist project. I mean, Zionism would be nothing without the United States. And there's this level of discontent with the U.S. agenda is really significant. And it's, I think, very threatening to the White House's project.
No, I think so for sure. I mean, they all seem to be melting down over how it's going to impact the elections next year, and I think we'll just have to see how that happens. But I think it is certainly, notable. I mean, one element of it in some ways is it is. And this is sort of a similar maybe continuation, Layan, but it does seem so dehumanizing. I mean, it simply says for people who are of Arab descent, people who are of the Muslim faith, to which this issue holds a very particular concern, in addition to all other people, that essentially you're like a second-class citizen, that you're not allowed. I mean, even the governor of New York, they said, how do you respond to the Palestinians in New York who are also worried about their families? And her first statement was, my statement to them is that they denounce Hamas. I mean, it's an amazing level of dehumanization, but how can that not drive outrage? So speak to that if you could, but I also want you to speak to, quickly before we let you go, something that I think you mentioned earlier, that there is a large event planned here in the United States on November 4th.
Yeah. No, it's definitely just examples of how the U.S. imperialist project really doesn't see the oppressed and struggling people of the world as human beings like it sees its own people. If you actually just skim through the New York Times and you look at the top headlines, it'll say things like, it's talking about the student movement right now, which is one of the focal points of the mainstream media. It will say Jewish students have very complicated emotions, are feeling a lot of grief and pain, and then it will move to Palestinian students are dismayed by the violence, which is very different. Apparently, Palestinian students don't have strong emotions. They're just dismayed by the unnameable violence. We don't know who did the violence, really erasing the fact that this is a 75-year genocidal occupation that people, even in exile, are feeling and are struggling against and are wanting to fight back against. And so I think this is very important to keep highlighting and keep showing because it really exposes the inhumane agenda and vision for the world that the United States has projected on everybody. And I'll end or finish here with November 4. There is a whole coalition of organizations, over over 100 endorsing organizations right now are calling for a major action at the White House on November 4. We will be gathering at Freedom Plaza at 2 p.m. People are coming from all over the country. If you go to the Answer Coalition website, there's a website there, a page there that's centralizing all of the information about buses. So you can find buses from Chicago to Florida, New York, Boston. You can add your own transportation information there if you want to help organize. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of people at the White House, all calling for a free Palestine, all asking for ending the siege on Gaza, asking Biden to cut all aid, demanding that Israel stops the firing, that there's a ceasefire. This is going to be extremely important. In the meantime, people are still on the streets every single day. It's really, really incredible. So hopefully we can keep building that momentum, and it's going to be a historic moment, a historic event. I hope that everyone can join us and really show the strength of these voices, and show that we're not afraid. We're going to keep mobilizing until these demands are achieved.
Layan Fuleihan of the People's Forum and 1804 Books, thank you for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.